Hey everyone, so today I'd like to talk about sparring at home, the swords you can and can't use when sparring at home, and also a concept that I'd like to call inconsequential sparring. So to start with, let's talk about swords you can and can't use at home. For starters, this here is my Katana. Never use a live blade when sparring. That's a sharp blade because it doesn't matter what protective equipment you have. You may have a shield or full plate armor, I don't care. A live blade should never be used because it's just unsafe. Now this katana came to me unsharpened with a rounded edge, but I still wouldn't recommend it for sparring because it is a 1.1, 1.2 kilo sword. If you hit this in the wrong place like the knee or the neck, then that could be a serious permanent injury or even death. So don't use these. So next down would be an iaito. So that's a aluminium zinc alloy sword. And those are quite light, they're about 400 grams, but they still shouldn't be used for sparring because they're not designed for contact sword on sword. They can break, they can splinter, and that's just unsafe. Moving away from metal swords, we have the Bokken. The Bokken is a hardwood sword-shaped piece of wood. It's probably the original type of practice sword. And these are really good if you've got full protective equipment, either HEMA gear, fencing gear, anything that will take out the brunt of the blow. So these were traditionally used, but now that we've got a little bit more safety in place, then these are really good with protective gear. Now without protective gear you can break bones with them. They are quite hard, they're quite solid, so I wouldn't recommend it without protective gear. But with protective gear these are fantastic. Another alternative to these are polypropylene swords. These are like wooden swords, they're a little bit lighter, but they also have a little bit more flex to them. So it doesn't hurt quite as much, and they're less likely to splinter or break. Now one down from these is the Shinai. So the Shinai is traditionally used in Japanese kendo, Korean kendo when you see their sparring, and it's a bamboo bokken essentially. But it's made up of multiple slats of bamboo, so there's a little bit more flex and a little bit more give, so when the strike hits, then it takes a bit of that force out of it. So they're really good with protective gear and they're traditionally used, you see them in all the competitions. Next down is a Bokken that's got a foam noodle on it. So the foam noodle is just LDPE. It's aerated, so it's got a little bit more mass. And this is what I use for sparring at home without protective gear with my sparring partner. They do hurt, but if you don't swing them full force, full power, and you're not trying to hurt each other, then you probably won't have significant injury from them. But it is still possible to break bones. But these are relatively safe. And traditionally, then, these were used as fukuro, Shinai, or pigeom in Korean, where they had a wooden core and they were wrapped in leather. Now the modern fukuro, Shinai, or pigeom is this. It's a surgical tubing core with foam around it and wrapped in cloth. And these are ultra safe. They're super soft, they flex, they completely flex, and it's 100% safety. These are safety swords. And now then my sparring partner and I use these at home, and we don't have any safety equipment, and you can't get injured with these, you really just can't. So what is inconsequential sparring? Inconsequential sparring is sparring where if you get hit, you just move on and nothing happens. And what happens there is that you lose the mindset of being in a sparring environment as a warrior, and you also have sloppy techniques. So I personally found this when I transitioned from using the foam-covered Bokken to using the safety swords. We found that our sparring rounds lasted a lot shorter because we'd get hit quicker. We focused less on defensive maneuvers and evasive maneuvers, and we had a heavy focus on just attacking. Now this has actually been criticized since the 1500s. So Musashi writes about it, and he criticizes the use of the Shinai in sword schools. And he says that they focus on learning how to strike and attack quickly, but they lose the mindset of defense and evasiveness, and they lose the mindset of a warrior. And it was likely an attack on Yagyu Shinkage-ryu, which used the Shinai since the 1540s. But he didn't explicitly say that, but from context it was pretty clear. Now similarly, in the 1920s, then the Japanese kendo looked at Korean gumdo, which is an offshoot in Korea of Japanese kendo, and they said the same thing about them, because in Japanese kendo then they practice sparring, kata and tameshigiri with a Shinai, Bokken and live sword respectively. However, in the 1920s in Korea then they only practiced sparring only with the Shinai. And so then the Japanese said that was a very basic level, very elementary level, and they lacked the right mindset of swords fighting. Now, this isn't isolated just to swords fighting. You see this with unarmed martial arts. You see some places practice non-contact sparring. And while it might be safe, then they lose the ideas of defense, positioning, and they have a heavy focus on what the practitioner can do in terms of attack rather than the flow of battle and having the right mindset in combat. So how do you fix this? I personally recommend two different ways of doing this. If you're in a sword school, it probably doesn't matter because you will be forced to learn about defensive and evasive maneuvers, and they won't let you get away with just attacking. But if you're just at home like I am and you're sparring in your living room or in your backyard, then a good way to do it is to focus on defensive techniques. Have rounds where you just defend and you evade rather than focusing on attacking. And the second way is add a punishment to any time when you get hit. So if you get hit on the arms, body or head, then make that 5, 10, 15 push-ups respectively. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up over many rounds. And so what that does is it instills fear of being hit, because now there's a punishment involved, there's some pain, there's some suffering, and you don't want to be hit anymore. There's some consequence to it. And so then because of that, then you develop a fear of being hit, and yet you'll still push through because you're in a sparring situation. And that is the mindset of a warrior. You see that as you gain confidence in your swordsmanship, confidence in yourself, and that translates to you having better swordsmanship, having better technique, and also that's applicable to general life because you'll be able to face problems head on with more confidence. So in summary, then the swords that you can and can't use, then I would say that a Bokken is probably the most hardcore that you can use with full protective equipment. Without protective equipment, there may be a Bokken with a foam protection or a safety sword. These are great. And for inconsequential sparring, then try and add a consequence to it because it will improve your technique, it will improve your mindset, and it will just make you a better swordsman overall. So that's all for today, and I'll see you next time.